Heal me for $1 million, the millionaire laughed, until the Muslim boy did it in seconds. We have a dream of reaching 1,000 subscribers by the end of this month. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and become part of our dream too. The laughter didn't sound like joy. It sounded like a man trying to prove to the world that nothing could touch him, not pain, not fear, not God. Richard Kane leaned back in the leather armchair on the small stage, microphone in hand, his designer watch flashing under the hotel ballroom lights. Cameras pointed at him from every direction, catching the smirk on his face as the audience of donors, doctors, influencers, and journalists chuckled along, some nervously, some eagerly. Behind him, a giant LED screen displayed his name in bold letters, Richard Kane, Health Revolution Summit. He was the kind of millionaire who bought hospitals like other people bought sneakers, and tonight he was here to show off his newest luxury clinic. He wasn't expecting a 12-year-old boy in a simple white shirt and scuffed sneakers to become the center of his night. The boy's name was Omar Rahman, and he stood at the edge of the room, where the carpet met the bare marble, clutching a folded flyer for the free community clinic across town. He hadn't come for the canapes, the speeches, or the flashing lights. He came because his father was parked outside in their dented car, waiting on a call from a job interview that might never come, and Omar had wandered in with a group from the community center invited to see how the other half lives. He watched as Richard joked about biohacking aging and outrunning death with money, each sentence followed by indulgent applause. It all felt wrong in Omar's chest. Not because he hated wealth, but because he could see something no one else seemed to notice, the way Richard pressed his left hand against his chest each time he laughed too hard. The way his fingers trembled for a fraction of a second. The way his eyes flashed with something like panic when the crowd wasn't looking. The moment began with a simple question. One of the moderators, a sleek woman in a navy blazer, leaned in and asked, "Mr. Kane, what do you say to people who still trust prayer or faith over modern medicine?" The room shifted slightly, as if everyone collectively held their breath. Richard's grin sharpened. "I say," he replied, "if prayer could fix everything, I'd have saved myself a few billion in research." Laughter. "Look, I respect people's beliefs," he continued, in a tone that made it clear he didn't, "but if anyone here thinks they can heal better than my doctors, I'll write them a check on the spot." He waved his hand dismissively. $1 million if you can heal me right now." The line was meant as a joke. The crowd laughed, relieved. Only one person didn't laugh. Omar stepped forward without even realizing his feet were moving. His heart pounded. His palms were damp. He wasn't a doctor. He wasn't special. He was just a kid who spent a lot of time in hospital corridors, sitting beside his father during panic attacks, listening to nurses, watching how people broke without anyone noticing. But in that moment, something stronger than fear pulled him toward the stage. A volunteer tried to stop him. "Hey, kid, you can't go up there," but Richard noticed and gestured lazily. "Let him come," he said into the microphone, amused. "The floor is open. Heal me, kid, and the million is yours." The ballroom went very quiet as Omar climbed the steps, eyes wide, hands shaking. He wasn't here for the money. He was here because he could see it now, clearer than anything. Richard Kane was not laughing because he was strong. He was laughing because he was breaking. For a moment, the entire ballroom froze. The cameras pointed at Richard slowly drifted toward the boy standing beside him, a 12-year-old who didn't belong in a room full of millionaires and medical executives. Omar looked small under the lights, his shoulders tense, his hands curled into uncertain fists. But his eyes, steady, focused, and impossibly calm, made Richard's smirk falter for just a second. The audience murmured, some amused, some confused, some annoyed that the show was being interrupted by a child. But Omar had already tuned the room out. His gaze wasn't on the cameras or the stage or the rows of expensive suits. His gaze was locked on the way Richard subtly rubbed his sternum between laughs, the faint wince he tried to hide each time he shifted in his chair. Omar didn't know the name for it, but he recognized pain when he saw it, the kind adults pretended didn't exist. Richard leaned back in his seat, adopting the posture of a king testing a jester. All right, doctor, he said into the microphone, voice dripping with mockery, show me your miracle. Laughter rippled through the crowd again, but weaker this time, more hesitant. Something about the boy's presence made people uneasy, as if mocking him felt wrong. Omar didn't speak right away. Instead, he moved to stand directly in front of Richard, close enough to see the fine sheen of sweat at the man's hairline. Omar didn't touch him. Didn't raise his hands like the dramatic healers in viral videos. He simply looked at Richard with a depth of empathy the millionaire had never encountered before. You're not sick in your body, Omar said softly, his voice barely above a whisper but somehow carrying across the ballroom. You're sick in your heart. The room went silent. Dead silent. Richard's smile wavered. Kid, don't get poetic with me, he snapped, suddenly defensive. This is a medical summit, not story hour. But Omar didn't back away. He leaned in a little, lowering his voice so only Richard could hear the next words, yet somehow, the quiet carried, and the nearest rows heard it too. You're scared all the time, Omar murmured. You think money can stop it. But it gets worse at night. That pressure right here, he pointed gently to Richard's chest. It's not from your heart failing. It's from trying to carry your whole life alone. Richard's eyes widened. His hand moved instinctively toward the very spot Omar indicated. For the first time that evening, the millionaire wasn't performing. He was exposed. A ripple of disbelief spread through the crowd. A doctor in the front row frowned, whispering to a colleague, how the hell did he see that? Another attendee, a woman in a silver dress, murmured, Richard's been hiding that chest pain for months. Richard shifted uncomfortably, his bravado rapidly peeling away. You don't know what you're talking about, he said, more quietly now. But Omar wasn't intimidated. It hurts right before you go to sleep, he continued. Worse when you're alone. And you're always alone, even when the room is full. Richard opened his mouth to retort, but nothing came out. His throat was tight. His heartbeat was loud in his ears. He didn't know how this kid could possibly know the truth he'd buried under seven-figure smiles and luxury distractions. And that's when it happened, the moment that shocked everyone. Richard Kane's eyes filled with tears. For a man like Richard Kane, tears were not an option. He hadn't cried at his father's funeral. He hadn't cried after his divorce. He hadn't cried when his own brother stopped speaking to him over a business deal gone wrong. Richard had built an empire on the idea that pain was a weakness and vulnerability was a disease. Yet here he was, sitting on a brightly lit stage in front of 200 wealthy guests, cameras pointed at him from every angle. And a single sentence from a 12-year-old boy had cracked open something he had spent a lifetime sealing shut. He blinked rapidly, as if trying to force the tears back into hiding, but the more he tried to hold the emotion down, the more violently it surged upward. The pressure in his chest. The same pressure he had mocked doctors for failing to diagnose. Tightened until he felt his breath hitch. He pressed a hand over his sternum, a gesture he'd done 1,000 times in secret, but this time there was no hiding it. A gasp rippled through the audience. Some guests exchanged confused glances, others leaned forward, stunned. The laughter that had filled the room just minutes earlier evaporated, replaced by a collective tension so sharp it felt like the air itself had frozen. Omar didn't move away. If anything, he stepped closer. It isn't pain from sickness, the boy said softly. It's pain from carrying things you never let yourself put down. Richard swallowed hard. His throat burned. You don't know me, he whispered, but the words trembled. You don't know the things I've handled, the pressure I'm under. I know the look of someone who hurts, Omar replied. The boy's voice wasn't accusatory. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply true. The kind of truth that bypassed pride and armor and went straight to the raw part of a person's soul. You think you can buy your way out of it, Omar continued. But your heart isn't hurting because something's wrong with your body. It hurts because something's wrong with your life. And no amount of money can stop that kind of pain. Something inside Richard shattered. A sob slipped out of him, small, strangled, almost childlike. Then another. The audience gasped as the billionaire, the titan of industry, the man who sold anti-aging treatments for the price of a car, pressed both hands to his face and began to cry openly. Not a dignified tear. Not a quiet sniffle. A complete emotional collapse. Camera flashes went wild. Reporters stood up from their seats. Influencers lowered their phones, stunned. Doctors whispered furiously among themselves, unsure whether they were witnessing a medical emergency or a miracle. But Omar didn't flinch. He placed a gentle hand on Richard's arm. A gesture so simple, so human, so profoundly out of place in the cold world Richard had built around himself. And the instant the boy touched him, Richard let out a long, shaking breath. And the pain in his chest eased. For the first time in months. Maybe years. The room fell completely silent. People could hear the hum of the air conditioner, the clicking of distant cameras, the trembling breaths of the millionaire who had spent a lifetime pretending he couldn't be broken. And that was the moment every guest in the ballroom realized. The boy hadn't just seen Richard's pain. He had reached it. He had changed it. He had healed it. Not with medicine. Not with magic. But with a truth Richard had never allowed himself to face. No one in the ballroom moved. It was as if time had stuttered, paused, and refused to continue until it understood what had just happened. 2 minutes earlier, Richard Kane had been the loudest man in the room, boasting, laughing, performing. Now he was hunched forward, elbows on his knees, face buried in trembling hands, while a 12-year-old boy stood beside him like a quiet anchor holding him together. People stared, but not with mockery anymore. They stared with awe. With disbelief. With something close to reverence. A woman near the front whispered, "He actually stopped crying." A doctor muttered, his breathing normalized in seconds. "How?" A journalist hissed, keep filming, though even her voice shook with something she didn't understand. Richard slowly lifted his head. His cheeks were streaked with tears. His throat was raw. But the most shocking change was in his eyes. The frantic panic that had lived there for months, maybe years, was gone. Eased. Quieted. Like a storm that had suddenly run out of thunder. Omar didn't step back. He kept his hand on Richard's arm, grounding him. "Can you breathe better now?" he asked softly. Richard nodded, almost disbelieving. Yes," he stammered. "Yes, I can." He inhaled deeply, and this time it didn't hurt. His chest expanded fully, something he hadn't allowed himself for years out of fear it would trigger another wave of pain. He blinked hard, touching the spot above his heart with gentle confusion. What did you do?" Omar shook his head. "I didn't fix your body," he said softly. "You just stopped fighting your heart." A sharp intake of breath went through the audience, like a collective gasp. And in that shocked silence, you could hear it all. The halt of silverware from the buffet. The rustling of dresses. The shifting of shoes. The unsteady breaths of people confronting something entirely outside the world they thought they understood. Richard stared at the boy, wiping his face with the back of his trembling hand. "You saw everything. All the things I hide." "How?" Omar shrugged lightly. "I just listen," he murmured. "And you've been screaming on the inside for a long time." Several people covered their mouths. A man's voice cracked somewhere in the crowd. A few women began crying quietly. Because they understood. Not about the money. Not about the challenge. Not about the stunt gone wrong. They understood that the boy wasn't healing in the way the millionaire mocked. He was doing something far more powerful. Seeing a man nobody else had ever truly seen. Richard swallowed, voice barely holding together. "I don't know what this is," he whispered. "But I feel lighter." He pressed a hand over his heart again, but this time not in pain. In wonder. Omar nodded. "You let yourself feel something real," he said. "That's all." Someone in the back of the room whispered, "Oh my God, this boy." Another murmured, Is this really happening?" And then As if waking from a trance, Richard suddenly stood up. The boy stepped back instinctively, startled. The millionaire turned toward the audience, breathing hard but steady, and raised a shaky hand. "I need," his voice cracked. He cleared his throat. "I need a moment." But the crowd didn't give him a moment. Instead, they erupted. Not in mockery. Not in laughter. Not in cynicism. They erupted in applause. A long, rolling, thunderous applause that filled the ballroom like a roar. People stood. People cried. People clapped until their hands shook. Because they knew. They had just witnessed something rare. Something real. Something impossible to deny. And this was only the beginning. The applause thundered so loudly it seemed to vibrate the chandeliers. Even the ballroom staff, waiters holding trays, security guards stiff against the walls, cleaners in the back, slowly joined in, clapping with wide eyes as if they, too, sensed the gravity of the moment. Richard Kane, a man who had built an empire on emotional invulnerability, now stood trembling before an audience witnessing the most human moment of his life. And beside him was a boy, small, calm, steady, who seemed completely unaffected by the spectacle he had just caused. As the applause faded into a charged, hopeful hush, Richard wiped his face again and turned slowly toward Omar. Something in his expression had changed. The arrogance was gone. The bravado stripped away. In its place was something far rarer, humility. "Come with me," he said softly, motioning toward the side of the stage. The boy blinked, unsure, but followed. The audience leaned forward, whispers rippling through the room as the two stepped away from the center lights and into a quieter corner behind a velvet curtain. Even in the dimness, Omar could see how scared Richard looked, not of him, but of the truth that had just torn through him. "Kid," Richard began, voice thick. "I don't know how you did what you did. Maybe you don't either. But whatever it was, it reached me." He pressed a hand to his chest again, testing the unfamiliar looseness in his lungs, the unexpected stillness in his heart. "I haven't breathed like this in months. I haven't felt," he stopped, looking almost embarrassed. "I haven't felt peace in a long time." Omar didn't respond. He didn't know what to say. He had only spoken what he felt, nothing more. But Richard wasn't finished. "And I made you an offer," he continued slowly. $1 million. If you could heal me." A wave of murmurs washed through the audience, some curious, some skeptical, many expecting Richard to walk back his promise. But instead, he shocked them all. Richard stepped back toward the microphone, voice clear. "I intend to keep that promise." Gasps erupted around the room. Some laughed in disbelief. A few clapped in approval. Omar shook his head immediately, stepping forward. "No," he said, surprising everyone with the firmness in his voice. "I don't want your money." The room fell into a stunned silence once more. Even Richard looked taken aback. "What?" Omar swallowed. "I didn't do it for money. I didn't do anything." "You listened to yourself for the first time." The humility in those words seemed to strike the room harder than the boy's earlier revelations. Richard stared at Omar as if hearing something he'd never been told before. "But you deserve something," he insisted. "You changed my life tonight." Omar hesitated. Then, with a shy breath, he said, "If you want to help, help the clinic. The free one. The community center clinic. They don't have much." The crowd murmured again, this time deeper, heavier, touched. Richard blinked, stunned. "You'd turn down $1 million for a clinic?" Omar nodded. "For the people who helped my dad. For the people nobody sees." A beat of silence. And then something extraordinary happened. Richard Kane, billionaire, titan, cynic, reached for the microphone, voice ringing with a clarity no one had ever heard from him. "Then I'll help them," he announced. "Not with 1 million. The audience held its breath. Not a whisper dared break the moment. but with $10 million. The room exploded. Cheers. Cries. Shouts of disbelief. Even staff were covering their mouths in shock. Omar stared up at him, stunned. 10. Richard smiled, this time gently, not arrogantly. You asked me to help people who help others. That deserves more than a single check. That deserves a commitment. And as the applause roared again, louder and more emotional than before, everyone in the ballroom knew. This night had transformed more than one life. It had turned a moment of humiliation into a moment of redemption. A boy's truth into a billionaire's awakening. A challenge into a miracle none of them would ever forget. News travels fast when wealth, humiliation, and something inexplicable collide. Within minutes of Richard Kane's breathtaking announcement, clips of the moment flooded the internet. Billionaire breaks down on stage, one headline read. Muslim boy refuses $1 million and asks for help for the poor, said another. On social media, the video spread like wildfire, shared, dissected, memed, praised, mocked. But not everyone was celebrating. As the guests in the ballroom returned to their tables in a stunned daze, 3 men in suits slipped to the back of the room, talking in hushed, panicked tones. They were executives from Richard's board. And they were furious. This is a disaster, one hissed. He can't give away $10 million on a whim, another snapped. He just admitted to emotional instability on camera. A third leaned in. We need to control the narrative before this gets out of hand. Their panic grew when they saw the look on Richard's face, calm, reflective, almost peaceful. It terrified them. A Richard Kane who felt things. A Richard Kane who cared. A Richard Kane who might stop prioritizing profits above all else. To them, it wasn't a miracle. It was a threat. Meanwhile, journalists and influencers swarmed Omar, crowding him with questions he didn't know how to answer. How did you do it? Did you hypnotize him? Are you gifted? Are you trained? The boy shrank back, overwhelmed, until Dr. Lena Morales, director of the community clinic, stepped between him and the cameras. Back up, she said firmly. He's a child. Not a spectacle. Her voice was sharp enough to slice through the chaos. Cameras paused. People stepped back. And for the first time since stepping onto the stage, Omar breathed. Dr. Morales knelt beside him. You did something remarkable tonight, she whispered. I didn't do anything, Omar murmured. I just told him what I saw. She smiled gently. Most adults can't say what they see. They hide it behind fear. You didn't. But even as Morales shielded Omar, the storm outside grew darker. A trending hashtag emerged, hashtag fake healing. Then another, hashtag millionaire meltdown. And finally, hashtag expose the boy. Some users accused Omar of manipulation. Others claimed Richard staged the collapse for publicity. A few extremists hurled hateful messages at the boy, calling him names, questioning his faith, mocking his calmness. The internet could turn compassion into controversy in seconds, and this night was no exception. Omar's phone buzzed nonstop with notifications until he turned it off completely. Inside the ballroom, Richard was whisked away by security to a private suite. He dismissed them all except for one request: bring the boy. But before Omar could reach him, the board executives intercepted Richard with icy expressions. We need to talk, one demanded. What you did tonight jeopardized the company. Richard stood taller than he had in years. No, he said firmly. What I did tonight saved me. This is not about saving you, the executive snapped. This is about controlling damage. There is no damage, Richard replied calmly. Only truth. But when he tried to step past them to find Omar, the men blocked him. This boy cannot be associated with our brand, they insisted. And you cannot publicly tie your medical empire to whatever this was. Richard's face hardened, not with arrogance, but with resolve. You don't get to tell me who helped me, he said. The men exchanged a look. Then you leave us no choice, one whispered. We'll handle this ourselves. And that was the moment everything shifted. Because as Richard pushed past them and opened the suite door, he found Omar waiting silently in the hallway. Just in time to overhear the executives calling him a liability. Omar's small shoulders tensed. But instead of crying, instead of backing away, he stepped forward. Not timidly, but with an eerie, serene courage. "I'm not here to hurt anyone," the boy said softly. "And I'm not here to take anything from you." He placed a hand on Richard's sleeve. The same gesture that had eased his pain earlier. And something extraordinary happened. The moment Omar touched him, Richard's chest loosened again. The pressure that had crept back during the argument dissolved instantly. His heartbeat softened. His breath steadied. The executives watched, speechless. Richard stared down at the boy with stunned clarity. "That," Richard whispered, voice cracking, "is what healed me." And the executives, men who had never believed in anything they couldn't measure, felt fear. Not of Omar, but of what they didn't understand. And this was only the beginning of the storm. The board executives left the suite in a silent fury, their polished shoes striking the marble floor like distant thunder. They didn't shout. They didn't threaten. People like them didn't need to. Their silence conveyed something far more ominous: calculation. They were already formulating their next moves, public statements, damage control strategies, legal angles, narrative spin. For them, Richard Kane wasn't a man who had just experienced a profound emotional breakthrough. He was an asset whose sudden humanity threatened billions. Richard watched them disappear down the hallway, jaw tense, shoulders rigid. Omar stood beside him, feeling the heavy shift in the air. It wasn't the same discomfort he had felt when Richard mocked prayer earlier. This was different. This was the cold, sharp fear of men who would do anything, to protect power. "Are they going to hurt you?" Omar asked softly. Richard shook his head. "Not physically. Men like that don't need fists. They use contracts. Lawyers. Shareholders. Reputation." He exhaled shakily. "And I may have just given them a reason to take everything." The boy tilted his head. "Why would they take something from you just because you told the truth?" Richard gave a bitter laugh, short, humorless. "Because truth is unpredictable. It's expensive. It asks for change. And change threatens people who make money by keeping things exactly as they are." He sank into the sofa, rubbing his temples. "I gave away $10 million on a live stream. I cried in front of the entire industry. I admitted I'm not invincible. They believe I've made myself weak." Omar hesitated, then sat beside him, not close, but near enough that Richard could feel the boy's quiet presence grounding him again. "Maybe," Omar said gently, "you made yourself human." Before Richard could answer, the door burst open. Not the executives. Not security. Reporters. Dozens of them. Flashes exploded. Microphones pushed forward. Voices shouted over one another like waves crashing against a cliff. "Mr. Kane, do you regret your donation? Was this boy planted? Is this a PR stunt? Why did you break down on stage? Is your company stable? Are you stepping down?" Richard froze, overwhelmed. His breathing tightened. Panic, familiar and cruel, clawed back into his chest. "Stop," he whispered. But the reporters pressed closer. "Mr. Kane, the board is meeting without you. Do you have a response? What do you say to critics calling this emotional instability? Is it true shareholders want you removed?" Richard staggered backward. His hands shook. His throat closed. His vision blurred. He was losing control again. Falling back into the same spiral that had suffocated him for years. Then Omar stepped between him and the reporters. A 12-year-old boy. Standing like a wall. Small, but unmovable. He raised a single hand. And the room Went quiet. Not because of authority. Not because of force. But because something in his calmness seized the entire crowd. Omar looked at the reporters with a composure far beyond his age. He told the truth, the boy said. And he's being punished for being honest. Isn't that the opposite of what people should want? His voice wasn't loud, but each word hit the reporters harder than any corporate statement could have. He hurt because he never let himself be human. Tonight he did. And if that scares people, Omar glanced back at Richard, then returned his gaze to the cameras. Maybe those people are the ones who need healing. A murmur spread through the crowd. Not skepticism. Not mockery. Something like shame. A reporter lowered her microphone. Another lowered his camera. Others exchanged glances, the kind that signaled they weren't sure who the story was about anymore, the billionaire who broke down, or the child who understood human suffering better than any doctor in the room. Richard felt the crushing pressure in his chest dissolve once again. Just by standing there, the boy had saved him, again. But outside the suite, in the bowels of the hotel, the board executives had begun their plan. A plan that would threaten Richard's empire. Omar's safety. And everything that had happened tonight. Because billion-dollar industries cannot afford miracles. And this boy had just created one. While the hotel ballroom buzzed with reporters trying to reinterpret what they had just witnessed, the real battle was happening several floors below, in a private conference room guarded by 2 security officers in dark suits. The room was small, windowless, and furnished with a long black marble table that reflected the tense faces of the board members seated around it. This wasn't a scheduled meeting. It wasn't on any calendar. It was an emergency gathering, one that would determine the fate of a billionaire, and a boy none of them understood. The moment the heavy door clicked shut, the board chairman, Marcus Levin, slammed a stack of printed screenshots onto the table. All of them showed Richard on stage, crying. Exposed. Vulnerable. This, Marcus growled, is the problem. Another executive flipped through the prints, scoffing. He looks like he's having a breakdown. Investors will panic. The stock will crash. A third whispered, the shareholders are already calling. They want an explanation. Or a replacement. Silence fell at the word replacement. Marcus steepled his fingers. Richard's been unpredictable for months. Tonight was the final straw. That boy humiliated him, and by extension, all of us. A woman at the far end of the table shook her head. Humiliated? Marcus, the world is calling it a miracle. Donations to the clinic are already spiking. Public sentiment is positive. Marcus's gaze turned ice cold. Public sentiment doesn't run a billion-dollar corporation. Control does. Stability does. Image does. He leaned forward. And tonight, Richard lost control. That makes him a liability. The executives murmured in agreement. But one among them, quieter and older, sighed. Or maybe, he muttered, he finally became human. Marcus shot him a glare sharp enough to cut glass. This company is not built on humanity, he snapped. It's built on precision. Predictability. We cannot afford a leader who cries on stage and gives away millions because a child tells him to. He slid a document across the table. A motion for an emergency vote. Effective immediately, we propose to remove Richard as CEO. Gasps echoed, some shocked, some thrilled, some terrified. But what about the boy? An executive asked. Marcus tapped his pen. Handled. Handled how? Marcus didn't answer directly. He simply said, people like him disappear from headlines quickly. The internet will move on. We'll release a statement saying Richard was manipulated during an emotional moment. He wasn't manipulated, the older executive snapped. Marcus raised a brow. And who will believe a boy from a community clinic over the board of Kane Medical Holdings? They all knew the answer. Too many people. And that was the problem. While the board plotted in shadows, upstairs, Richard sat with Omar in the quiet suite. I think they're going to take everything from me, Richard admitted, voice low. Omar blinked deeply. Then you'll still have you. Richard looked at the boy, this strange, perceptive, impossibly sincere boy, and something inside him steadied. Whatever happens, Omar said gently, truth doesn't disappear just because powerful people don't like it. Then, there was a knock on the door. Not frantic. Not polite. Sharp. Calculated. Richard stood, tension tightening his spine. He opened the door. And froze. 3 board executives were standing there. Behind them, a lawyer. And behind the lawyer, 2 private security agents. We need you to sign something, Marcus said coldly, holding out a document. We're removing you from your position as CEO, effective immediately. Omar stepped forward. You can't do that, he said. Marcus stared down at him with disdain. Child, this is business. Stay out of it. Omar didn't flinch. Hurting someone because they changed, he said quietly, is not business. It's fear. The lawyer scoffed. This boy is interfering. But before he could finish, Richard straightened with a new fire in his eyes. No, he said sharply. He's telling the truth. Something you haven't done in years. Marcus's eyes narrowed. Sign. Or we initiate a full smear campaign. Starting with him. He pointed at Omar. Richard's breath caught. Omar's expression didn't change, just grew calmer, eerily calm. You don't scare me, the boy said. But you should be scared of the world seeing what you're doing. Marcus smirked. No one will ever know. But he was wrong. Very wrong. Because down the hall, unnoticed, a hotel staff member had been recording everything. And the video was already uploading. The executives didn't know they had already lost. Power makes people arrogant. It blinds them. It convinces them that whatever happens in a quiet hallway, whatever threats, whatever coercion, will stay confined to that narrow space. Marcus Levin, cold and confident, leaned closer to Richard with the signed termination document in hand, whispering, "You will sign, and this will end quietly." But 2 doors down, in a service alcove partially hidden behind a floral arrangement, a young hotel staff member, a housekeeping trainee named Jenna Ruiz, had been frozen in shock since the moment she overheard Marcus threaten the 12-year-old boy. She didn't know who Richard Kane really was, didn't understand corporate politics, didn't even know the boy's name. But she knew what injustice looked like. She knew cruelty when she heard it. Her phone recorded everything. And without thinking, without planning, her thumb hit upload. The last thing she saw on her screen before panic made her run was the message. Posting to public, your video is now live. Back in the suite, Richard stared at the men trying to strip him of everything he had built. His jaw clenched. His hands curled into fists. He looked ready to give in, not because he wanted to, but because he knew these men were ruthless enough to destroy Omar if he resisted. Stop, he murmured. Leave the boy out of this. Marcus smirked. Then sign. But before Richard could reach for the pen, his phone buzzed violently in his pocket. Then again. Then again. Notifications exploded on every device in the room, every executive's phone, every lawyer's tablet, every security agent's earpiece. A strange synchrony overtook the hallway, like an invisible wave. One of the guards pulled out his phone, frowning. What the hell? He turned the screen toward Marcus. On it was a live stream replaying right there, in real time. Marcus threatening Omar. Marcus calling the boy a liability. Marcus vowing to smear him. Marcus demanding Richard sign or the child would be ruined. The image was crystal clear. The audio unmistakable. The video already had thousands of views. By the time Marcus snatched the phone from the guard's hand, it jumped to 15,000 views. 20,000. 40,000. A tidal wave. Marcus's face drained of color. Who recorded this? Who? But it didn't matter anymore. It was too late. A second buzz shook the room. This time from the lawyer's device. A breaking news alert. Board threatens child in corporate power struggle. Leaked video goes viral. The lawyer swallowed hard. Marcus, this is already everywhere. Omar stepped forward slightly, watching the adults unravel. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply observed, quiet, steady, like someone watching a truth finally find the light. Richard reached over, pulled the torn document from Marcus's trembling hand, and calmly ripped it into pieces. The sound of tearing paper echoed like thunder. "You underestimated me," Richard said softly. "But more importantly, you underestimated him." He nodded toward Omar. Marcus tried to recover his composure. "This isn't over." Richard stepped closer. "Oh, it's very over," he whispered. "Because you threatened a child, and the world saw it." Another notification buzzed. This time Omar's phone lit up in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw comments flooding in. "Protect the boy." "Board must resign." "Fire Levin." "Corporate monsters exposed." "Richard, sue them." "Omar, you're a miracle." The wave of public outrage wasn't stopping. It was accelerating. Marcus staggered back a step, breathing hard. You don't understand. The shareholders will destroy you," Richard cut in, "before they destroy a boy who just made me the most human I've ever been." The hallway door opened. Hotel staff flooded in. Journalists peeked from behind them. Someone announced loudly, "The video has hit 3 million views in 15 minutes. Omar blinked, overwhelmed. Richard placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You didn't just heal me," he murmured. "You healed the truth, and made it impossible to hide." And for the first time since the night began, Omar smiled. Just a small smile. Soft, but powerful enough to shake the world. The board members had walked into that private corridor believing they controlled the world. They believed money insulated them. That lawyers shielded them. That silence protected them. But by the time the video reached 10 million views, their power began to crumble faster than any of them imagined. The financial markets opened early for pre-trading in Asia, and Kane Medical Holdings, once a pillar of corporate stability, began plummeting. Not because Richard had cried. Not because he had donated money. But because the board had been caught threatening a 12-year-old boy on camera. No investor in the world wanted their name attached to that. Marcus Levin's phone exploded with calls. Shareholders. Senior partners. PR firms. Regulators. Every voice screamed some version of the same thing. "What did you do?" He barked back explanations, lies, half-truths, excuses, but none of them mattered. The world had seen the unfiltered reality. The video had already been translated into 7 languages. Activists were calling for a full inquiry. Academics called it corporate cruelty. Even politicians retweeted it, condemning the board's behavior. Marcus felt the empire he had controlled for decades dissolving beneath his feet like wet sand. Meanwhile, upstairs, Richard and Omar sat in the quiet suite watching the storm unfold across every screen. For the first time in years, Richard wasn't afraid. His empire might be collapsing, his board might be turning on him, but a strange peace settled over him, a peace he hadn't felt since before the panic started consuming his life. "They're going to fall," he whispered. "All of them." Omar looked up at him. "Not because of you," the boy said softly, "but because of what they chose." That truth landed with the weight of a revelation. Richard wasn't orchestrating anything. He wasn't manipulating the moment. The board had simply been exposed, and the world was done tolerating men who hid cruelty behind polished suits and corporate slogans. The hallway outside the suite erupted with noise as hotel staff, reporters, and security scrambled. A senior journalist pushed forward with a camera crew. "Mr. Kane, the shareholders are demanding the entire board step down. Do you intend to return as CEO?" Richard hesitated. For the first time, he felt no hunger for power. No desire for the throne they tried to rip from him. No, he said slowly. I don't want the company the way it was. Not if the cost is my humanity. His words echoed across every recorded device in the room. Another journalist lifted her mic. What do you want, then? Richard looked at Omar, and in that moment, the answer was clear. I want to rebuild, Richard said. Not my empire, myself. And I want this company to serve people, not threaten them. If the board steps down, we start fresh. Gasps rippled through the journalists. No CEO walked away voluntarily. But Richard wasn't walking away from responsibility, he was walking away from corruption. And the boy, someone asked. What happens to him? Richard laughed softly. He's already done more good than any executive in that boardroom ever has. He placed a reassuring hand on Omar's shoulder. This boy gave me something no amount of money ever could. Omar's eyes widened. Peace. Clarity. And a reason to choose truth over fear. Downstairs, the boardroom descended into chaos. Shareholders were screaming. Lawyers were panicking. News networks were calling. And as pressure mounted, one by one, board members began resigning, each resignation a tiny crack in the monolith of power that had once seemed unbreakable. Marcus was the last to resist. He stood in the center of the boardroom shouting into a phone, I can fix this. I can handle it. But another alert cut him short. Global petition, remove Marcus Levin, 1.2 million signatures and rising. His hands shook. His voice cracked. He dropped the phone. By noon the next day, Marcus Levin, the man who believed he could crush a child for corporate gain, was escorted out of the building under flashing cameras and deafening public outrage. He didn't even get to pack his office. And as he disappeared into the back of a car, disgraced, the world finally understood something. A billionaire hadn't fallen because of a scandal. A corporation hadn't collapsed because of a donation. A board hadn't crumbled because of bad PR. They fell because a quiet Muslim boy told the truth. And the world finally listened. With the board dissolved and Marcus Levin removed in a storm of global outrage, a strange, heavy calm washed over the city. For the first time since the incident, Richard Kane walked outside without security pressing on all sides of him. No suits. No handlers. Just him, Omar, and Dr. Lena Morales, the director of the small community clinic the boy had defended so fiercely. They sat together in the clinic's tiny, sunlit waiting room, which smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper brochures. It wasn't glamorous. The walls were cracked. The seats were mismatched. The front desk computer froze every 10 minutes. But Richard felt something in this room he didn't feel in his penthouse or corporate offices: truth, humanity, and the weight of a second chance. He looked around the humble space, absorbing every detail. This is where you come? He asked Omar quietly. The boy nodded. My dad brings me here when I get sick. They help everybody. Dr. Morales smiled faintly. We do what we can with what little we have. Richard exhaled. Not anymore. He reached into his jacket and unfolded a document, one he had stayed up all night drafting. I'm creating something new, he said. A fund. A foundation. A permanent resource for people like you, like this clinic, like every family that can't afford to fall apart. Dr. Morales blinked. Richard, are you sure? After everything that's happened? He nodded. What happened didn't ruin me. It freed me. He placed the papers on the table. I'm calling it the Miracle Fund. Omar's eyes widened. For miracles? Richard shook his head. For people, he corrected. For kids who tell the truth even when adults don't listen. For communities ignored by people like me for too long. Dr. Morales ran her fingers over the papers. 10 million, per year? Guaranteed, Richard answered. With independent oversight. No corporate games. No loopholes. Real support. Omar whispered, "You did this because of the stage?" Richard smiled softly. "No. I did this because of you." But word of the fund spread faster than Richard expected. By noon, reporters were already crowding outside the clinic, clamoring for statements. Social media exploded with hashtags. Hashtag Miracle Fund. Hashtag Omar changed everything. Hashtag healing the world. Celebrities endorsed it. Politicians praised it. Strangers donated small amounts that collectively turned into millions. People weren't just inspired by Richard's transformation. They were inspired by the boy who had sparked it. A boy who had healed not through magic, but through truth spoken without fear. That afternoon, during a small press conference outside the clinic, a reporter pointed a microphone toward Omar. "Do you think you performed a miracle?" she asked. Omar shook his head instantly. No, the reporters leaned in. "Then what happened?" Omar thought for a long moment, then said something that silenced the entire crowd. "I didn't heal him. I just reminded him that he was alive." The words hit Richard harder than any revelation before. He felt tears burning behind his eyes, not of pain, but of clarity. The crowd erupted in applause, but Omar didn't smile to impress anyone. He simply stepped back beside Richard, calm as ever. That evening, donations continued pouring in. By midnight, the Miracle Fund had reached $87 million. Clinics across the country requested support. Families sent messages of hope. And quietly, softly, the world began to believe again, not in money, not in corporations, but in compassion. In the small apartment he shared with his father, Omar sat on his bed reading messages from thousands of strangers thanking him. He didn't feel like a savior. He didn't feel special. He just felt peaceful. Meanwhile, Richard sat at his own table, staring at the signed founding documents. He whispered a promise to himself. "This time, I build something that matters." And for the first time in his life, he meant every word. The day after the Miracle Fund passed $100 million, New York felt different, lighter somehow, as if the city itself understood that something rare had happened within its concrete veins. People recognized Omar on the street. Some waved. Some thanked him. Some simply smiled with a softness that hadn't been there before. He wasn't a celebrity, not in the way the world usually defined it. He was something else entirely, a reminder of what humanity looked like before fear and pride and power made life complicated. And deep down, he didn't want fame. He only wanted the world to breathe easier, like Richard had finally learned to do. Richard spent the morning at the clinic, not for an event, not for a performance, but simply to watch people being helped. He sat beside a young mother filling out forms, helped a senior find his medication, even organized files for the volunteers. At one moment, he paused by a cracked window and saw Omar outside, sitting on the curb with two little kids, showing them how to write their names in Arabic. Richard felt emotion rise in his chest again, not the crushing panic he once feared, but a warm, steady swell that made him feel more human than he had ever been. He stepped outside quietly and sat beside them. The children giggled as Omar traced the letters with their fingers. "You're good with people," Richard said. "You see them." Omar looked up with calm eyes. "You're good with people too," he replied. "You just forgot for a while." Richard laughed softly. "That's fair." Then his expression turned thoughtful. "You know, after everything the board did, after everything I let myself become, I thought the world was done with me." Omar shook his head. "The world isn't done with anyone who tries again." His voice held a wisdom far beyond his years. Richard felt his throat tighten. "You healed more than you know, kid." But Omar shook his head gently. "I didn't heal anything. I just didn't lie." That afternoon, Richard invited Omar and his father to a small gathering at the clinic. There were no cameras. No investors. No polished speeches. Just nurses, volunteers, community members, and a few families who had already benefited from the new fund. Dr. Morales handed Omar a handmade plaque carved from reclaimed wood, to the boy who reminded us that truth heals. Omar turned pink with embarrassment, but everyone clapped. Richard stepped forward next and cleared his throat. "I've been called many things in my life," he said. "Rich, ruthless, brilliant, difficult. But no one ever called me whole." He placed a hand on Omar's shoulder. "Until this kid showed me what I was missing." A hush fell over the room. The kind that happens when truth lands with perfect weight. Richard continued, "I had millions. I had influence. I had buildings with my name on them. But I didn't have peace. I didn't have purpose. You gave me that." He looked directly at Omar. "You changed me. Not with magic. Not with power. With a moment of honesty that I didn't know I needed." Omar swallowed, unsure how to respond. Richard smiled. "You told me I wasn't breathing. Now I can." The crowd erupted into applause, and Richard inhaled deeply, steady, slow, unbroken. The kind of breath a man takes when he is finally unafraid. After the applause died, Omar's father approached Richard and shook his hand firmly. "Thank you for honoring my son," he said. Richard shook his head. "No. Thank him for saving me." Omar stood between the two men, feeling both small and enormous at once, as if he were still just a child, and yet somehow part of something much bigger than himself. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the skyline, Richard and Omar walked together outside the clinic. Cars rolled by. People hurried home. Life moved on, but everything felt new. "So," Richard asked, "what will you do now?" Omar thought for a moment. "I'll keep telling the truth," he said simply. "That's enough for anyone." Richard smiled, a soft, genuine smile he once believed he'd forgotten how to make. He knelt to the boy's eye level. "Then the world is in good hands." They shook hands, not as billionaire and boy, not as miracle and seeker, but as equals connected by a moment that had changed both of their lives forever. And as they walked their separate ways that night, New York glimmered above them, brighter than before, as if the city itself understood that a miracle had happened within its streets. A miracle made not of magic, but of truth, courage, and the quiet, unstoppable power of a child who refused to look away. If you made it this far, subscribe, leave your like, and tell us where you're watching from. Thank you, and see you next time.